She thought the funeral would be the day she said goodbye to her grandmother, not the day her own family tried to erase her from the inheritance. Everyone in that small Ontario funeral home kept speaking in soft voices around Serena, but behind their lowered eyes and careful condolences, they were already preparing to corner her before the burial was even over. Less than an hour later, while the rain darkened the cemetery road and her relatives waited near a shadowy side door with papers in hand, the estate lawyer quietly told her to follow him instead, and the moment she saw who was waiting in that dark room, she understood her grandmother had known exactly what kind of people she was leaving behind. Before we get into this story, I want to hear from you first. Type "I'm here" and tell me which city in Canada you're listening from, because I always love seeing where everyone is watching from. And for everyone who already liked and subscribed, I pray that God makes your burdens lighter, opens new doors for you, and keeps you and your family safe. Alright, stay with me, because this story started with a funeral and turned into something far uglier than grief. My name is Serena, and if you looked at my family from the outside, you probably would have thought we were one of those close-knit immigrant families that worked hard, stayed together, and respected our elders. That was the version people in Mississauga liked to believe, especially the customers at my parents' restaurant. We weren't rich, but the place did well enough. It sat on a busy street near a plaza with a pharmacy, a dental office, and a bakery that always smelled like cinnamon in the mornings. People knew my parents there. They knew my younger sister Valerie too, because my family always put her at the front, smiling at customers like she was the face of our future. Valerie had the kind of beauty people noticed instantly. She had bright eyes, perfect skin, and that smooth way of talking that made strangers feel special after 30 seconds. My mother loved putting her by the register in fitted sweaters and soft makeup, telling everyone she had a natural gift with people. My father used to beam whenever regulars complimented her. Even when we were teenagers, relatives would pinch Valerie's cheek and say, "This one is a star." Then they would look at me and say something else. Sometimes it was, "Serena is the dependable one." Sometimes, "Not everyone has to stand out. Some daughters are meant to support the family quietly." And sometimes they didn't say anything at all, which somehow felt worse. I was the one in the kitchen at 13, learning inventory before I learned how to enjoy summer. I was the one washing bins, staying late, and taking the first subway home after helping close. When the restaurant had a plumbing issue, I was there. When suppliers delivered the wrong order, I handled it. When my mother got tired or my father snapped at staff, I was the one who smoothed things over. Valerie worked too, but only in the polished, visible way my parents liked. She was the smile. I was the labor that kept the smile standing. The only person who ever said that out loud was my grandmother. Her name was Trinity. She lived in a small town in Ontario, the kind of place where everyone knew which family had lived in which house for 40 years. She had moved there long before I was born, back when my grandfather was still alive, and the town still had a hardware store everyone called by the owner's first name. After he died, she stayed in the same white house with the deep porch and peeling blue trim, and every summer when I was growing up, she asked me to come visit. She never acted like Valerie was the golden child, or I was the invisible one. She never made me feel like I had to earn the right to sit down. At her place, I wasn't the extra pair of hands. I was just her granddaughter. When I was little, she taught me how to make butter tarts without overworking the dough. When I got older, she let me sit with her at the kitchen table while she paid bills or sorted papers, and she'd talk like I was an adult long before anyone else did. She used to say, "You notice things, Serena. That will save you one day." At the time, I thought she meant in some vague life advice kind of way. I didn't know she meant exactly what would happen at her funeral. By the time I was 28, I was living in Toronto in a one-bedroom apartment near a streetcar line. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I worked for a catering supply company handling operations and client scheduling, which basically meant I spent my days solving other people's emergencies with spreadsheets, calm emails, and a face that looked less stressed than I felt. I still helped my parents whenever they called, but I had put some distance between myself and the restaurant. Not enough for them to stop leaning on me, but enough to breathe. Valerie, meanwhile, was still in Mississauga, still orbiting my parents like their chosen future. She had recently started calling herself the brand image of the restaurant, which would have been funny if everyone around her hadn't said it like it was a real executive title. My Aunt Taylor and my Uncle Wyatt lived closer to Grandma than the rest of us, or at least close enough to say they did. In practice, that meant they visited just often enough to be seen by neighbors and then loudly mentioned it to everyone else. Taylor was my mother's older sister, sharp-faced and always dressed one level too formally for every occasion. Wyatt wasn't blood family, but he had married into the family years earlier and carried himself like every room owed him attention. Their son Vincent had inherited both their worst qualities, the smugness of someone mediocre who had been praised too much. When Grandma's health started declining faster, everyone suddenly became very interested in her again. That was the first thing that bothered me. For months, I had been driving from Toronto when I could, bringing groceries, helping with appointments, sitting with her when she was too tired to do much more than nap and talk in fragments. But in the last few weeks before she passed, my relatives became almost aggressively attentive. Taylor kept posting vague family photos online with captions about cherishing precious time. Wyatt started mentioning property taxes and what happens next in a tone that sounded practical on the surface and hungry underneath. Valerie, who had barely visited Grandma alone in years, suddenly started calling her our sweet matriarch in front of other people. Grandma noticed it too. One evening, about 3 weeks before she died, I was helping her put away dishes after dinner. She moved slower than she used to, and I remember how carefully she held the edge of the counter before turning. The kitchen window over the sink showed the last pale bit of evening over the yard. "Your aunt has been asking odd questions," she said. I dried my hands on a towel and looked over.
About what?
My papers. The house. The cottage. Whether I already signed this or that. She gave a dry little laugh that had no humor in it. Funny how people become curious when they think your time is getting short. Something cold moved through my chest. Did she ask directly? Not directly enough to feel honest. Grandma closed a cabinet and turned to me. "Serena, listen to me carefully. People show their true face around illness and funerals. Sometimes sooner than around money. Usually both together." I tried to brush it off then because I didn't want to have that kind of conversation with her. Maybe they're just worried about logistics. She gave me a look. Not harsh. Just disappointed in my effort to soften reality. "You always do that," she said quietly. "You turn a sharp thing in your hand and tell yourself it might not cut." I still remember how ashamed I felt because she was right. After that, she changed the subject and asked if I'd taken some leftovers for the drive back to Toronto. That was her way. She would hand you a warning and then protect your heart for a few minutes by talking about food. I wish I had pressed her harder that night. A week later, she ended up in hospital. I came as often as I could. The halls smelled like sanitizer and old coffee, and the fluorescent lights made everyone look exhausted, even at noon. Taylor cried loudly when nurses were around. Valerie posted a filtered photo of clasped hands and a caption about family strength. Wyatt paced and talked about stress. I sat by the bed and rubbed lotion into Grandma's dry hands while she slept. The day before she died, she woke up clearer than she had in days. I was alone with her then. Rain tapped softly against the hospital window. Her voice was weak, but her eyes were steady. "There are things people think you don't understand," she said. I leaned closer. "You should rest."
No.
"Listen." She squeezed my fingers with surprising strength. "Not everyone there loves you." I froze. "Grandma." "You think kindness keeps you safe," she whispered. "It does not. It only makes cruel people think you will step aside." My throat tightened so badly I could barely answer. "Why are you saying this?" Her gaze drifted past me for a second, then came back. "Because I know my family." That was the last real conversation we had. She died early the next morning. I got the call while I was standing in my apartment kitchen in Toronto, waiting for my kettle to boil before work. For a second, I didn't even understand what my mother was saying. Everything in me went strangely blank. Then the kettle clicked, and that stupid tiny sound is what made it feel real. By the time I got to the small town, the whole place looked gray and wet. It had rained on and off all day, and the roads glistened under the low sky. The funeral home was one of those older brick buildings with narrow front steps and tasteful flower arrangements that tried to make grief look organized. Cars lined the curb. Relatives I only saw at weddings or funerals stood in little clusters under umbrellas, murmuring to each other. My mother hugged me quickly, but even then she felt distracted. Valerie, in a fitted black dress and a wool coat that looked too expensive for a funeral in the rain, pressed her cheek to mine and said, "You look exhausted. Did you drive all the way in this weather?" I stared at her. "Hi to you too." She gave a breathy laugh. "I'm just saying, you should freshen up before more people arrive." That was Valerie. Every insult came gift-wrapped like concern. Inside, the funeral home was overly warm. The carpet muted footsteps. Everything smelled faintly like lilies and coffee, and that sweet, stale air public buildings seemed to trap. Grandma's casket was at the front of the room under soft lights, and seeing it knocked the breath out of me so hard I had to stop walking. No matter how old you are, there is something unbearable about seeing the person who loved you best reduced to stillness and satin. For a minute, I forgot everyone else. I forgot the rain, the parking lot, the strained faces, the quiet politics of family. I just stood there and looked at her. Then I heard Wyatt's voice from across the room. "Well, if the house goes on the market before winter, at least we won't have to deal with frozen pipes." I turned. He was standing with Taylor and Vincent near one of the side tables, holding a paper cup of coffee like this was a community meeting instead of a visitation. Taylor nodded, lips pursed, and Vincent said something about smart timing. My stomach dropped. Grandma hadn't even been buried yet. I looked around to see if anyone else seemed bothered, but my mother was speaking to a cousin near the guest book, and Valerie was adjusting flowers like she was arranging a display. No one reacted. Or maybe they did, and just hid it better. That was the second thing that bothered me. Not just that they were discussing selling her house so soon, but that they were doing it like it was normal. I went to stand near the casket again, mostly because if I stayed where I was, I might say something that would turn the room into a scene. I could feel anger rising under my grief, and I hated that those two things were mixing already. A few minutes later, Taylor approached me with a soft face she only wore when witnesses were nearby. "Sweetheart," she said, touching my arm, "you're holding up so well." I stepped back slightly. "I'm trying." She wouldn't want us all falling apart. Taylor tilted her head toward the family room at the back. "There are a few practical things we'll need to handle later, but nothing difficult. Just formalities, really." The word hit me wrong instantly. What formalities? Oh, not now. Her smile never slipped. Later. After the burial, maybe. We just have to make sure everything moves smoothly. You know how paperwork is. I didn't know how paperwork was. That was exactly why I didn't trust anyone who called it just paperwork. Before I could ask anything else, she was already moving away to greet another guest, her expression changing seamlessly into public grief. Tell me honestly in the comments, have you ever had that moment where someone speaks softly to you, but every instinct in your body says not to trust a single word they're saying? Because that was exactly how I felt standing there. And I'll say this now. Grief can make you doubt yourself, but sometimes your unease is the clearest truth in the room. The service itself passed in a blur of hymns, folded tissues, and carefully controlled tears. People spoke about Grandma's generosity, her baking, her kindness, her strength. All of that was true. But every time someone said she kept the family together, I had to look down because I knew what was coming next. Families love praising the dead when the dead can no longer interrupt lies. At the cemetery, the rain came down. Harder. It wasn't a storm, just that steady cold. Ontario rain that gets into your sleeves and shoes and makes everything feel heavier. Mud clung to the edges of the grass. Umbrellas bumped together.
The
priest's voice drifted in and out under the weather. I stood there in my black coat, my fingers numb around the handle of my umbrella, and watched the casket lowered into the ground. I cried then, not delicately,
not
beautifully. My face hurt, my nose stung, and for a few minutes I didn't care.
Who saw?
I thought about butter tarts and old radio songs, and the way Grandma used to keep a tin of peppermints in her purse. I thought about her telling me, not everyone there loved me. I thought about how she must have known she was leaving me in the middle of wolves. Afterward, while people slowly broke apart into smaller groups, Valerie came over and looped her arm through mine. You should come with us, she said. With who? Aunt Taylor, Mom, everyone. We're going back to the funeral home for coffee and to sort a few things out. I wiped my face. What things? She gave me a patient little smile, like I was the difficult one. Serena, don't make this into something dramatic. It's literally just some estate paperwork, so we can keep things moving. The air around me seemed to go very still. What paperwork? Why are you being like this? She whispered, her voice sharpening. No one is trying to trick you. I looked at her. Really looked at her. Her mascara was perfect. Her coat was dry under the umbrella Wyatt held over both of them. She looked irritated, not grieving. That was the third thing that bothered me. Not her words. Her timing. I pulled my arm away. Then you won't mind explaining it before I sign anything. Valerie's jaw tightened for one quick second. Then she smiled again. Of course. It's only a formality. There was that word again. I was about to answer when a man in a dark charcoal coat stepped toward us from the edge of the cemetery path. I recognized him after a second from the hospital and from 1 or 2 earlier meetings with Grandma. He was not old, but he carried himself with the quiet gravity of someone people listened to when paperwork could ruin lives. His name was Tristan Hale, Grandma's estate lawyer. Serena, he said calmly, may I have a moment? Valerie's hand closed around my elbow again before I could move. We were just heading back. Tristan's expression didn't change, but something about him seemed to sharpen. Yes, he said. That is why I need a moment with Serena now. Valerie let go. I followed him a few steps away from the others, rain pattering on nearby umbrellas and soaking the cemetery path until it gleamed black. He didn't waste time. They're going to ask you to sign something today, he said quietly. Don't. For a second, I honestly thought I hadn't heard him correctly. What? Do not sign anything they put in front of you. Not at the funeral home, not at the house, not in the car, not anywhere. A cold wave went through me from my scalp to my hands. Why? Because your grandmother expected this. He glanced over my shoulder toward my family, then back at me. Follow me when you return to the funeral home. Do not mention this conversation. Do you understand? I stared at him, barely breathing. Do you understand? He repeated. Yes, I whispered. Good. Then he simply stepped back and returned to the general crowd, as if he had only offered condolences. I stood there in the rain, feeling like the ground under me had tilted. When we got back to the funeral home, I expected chaos. I expected open pressure, raised voices, something obvious. Instead, everything was worse because it was controlled. Coffee was poured. Trays of sandwiches appeared. People spoke in low tones about weather, travel times, and who was staying overnight in town. And threaded through all of it was this quiet, organized momentum pushing towards something I still hadn't seen. Taylor kept saying things like, once we settle the administrative side, everyone can breathe. Wyatt mentioned clean transitions. Vincent said, no point dragging things out. My mother looked tired, but avoided my eyes. Valerie stayed near me like she was making sure I didn't wander off. That was when I knew for certain the lawyer was right. Families who have nothing to hide do not watch you that closely. The funeral home had a long hallway leading to smaller rooms at the back, an office, a prep room, a staff kitchen, and a narrow side entrance that opened toward the parking lot. I had been there once years before for another funeral. The place felt even dimmer now in the late afternoon, the light outside already going blue from the rain clouds. About 20 minutes after we returned, Taylor finally made her move. She approached carrying a folder. Serena, she said softly, could you come with me for 1 minute? We just need your signature on a simple document, so there's no confusion later. My mouth went dry. Valerie appeared at Taylor's shoulder almost instantly. It's really nothing complicated, she added. Wyatt stood a few feet behind them, hands in his coat pockets, expression neutral in that false way men get when they think intimidation works better without raised voices. I forced myself to look confused instead of alarmed. What document? Taylor sighed like I was already becoming inconvenient. A waiver for procedural clarity. Since you live in Toronto and don't want the burden of dealing with property issues in this town, this lets the rest of us move ahead efficiently. I felt something slam into place in my head. There it was. Not grief. Not logistics. Not concern. A waiver. My share. And they had expected to slide it in front of me on the day we buried Grandma, counting on tears, exhaustion, and pressure to do the rest. I looked at the folder in Taylor's hand. I haven't read anything. That's why we'll explain, Valerie said quickly, smiling too hard. You're making this sound bigger than it is. I almost laughed at that, but there was too much anger in me for anything to come out cleanly. Then, from the other end of the hallway, Tristan Hale appeared. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't hurry. But the second he stepped into view, the whole atmosphere changed. Serena, he said, I need you for a moment. Taylor turned. We're in the middle of something. No, Tristan said evenly. You were about to begin something. Serena, come with me. I looked at my aunt, my sister, and Wyatt. For the first time that day, their calm looked strained. Valerie recovered first. Can it wait? We just need 30 seconds. Tristan's eyes moved to the folder and then back to her face.
No.
It cannot. I wish I could say I felt brave walking away with him. I didn't. I felt terrified. Because once a secret starts to come into view, part of you wants the full truth, and another part is scared it will confirm everything you didn't want to believe. I followed Tristan down the dim hallway toward the side of the building where the carpet changed to older hardwood. We passed framed prints of lakes and church steeples. The sound of family voices faded behind us, replaced by the hum of weak overhead lights and distant rain tapping against the side entrance. He stopped in front of a dark wooden door near the back. The hall light above it flickered once. He looked at me, and his voice dropped lower. Your grandmother prepared for this. My pulse was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. Prepared for what exactly? For the possibility that some members of your family would try to pressure you into signing away rights that belong to you. I couldn't speak. He opened the door. Inside the room, under the warm yellow light of an old lamp, 3 people were waiting. The first was a notary public with a leather briefcase open on the table. The second was an older man I recognized after a stunned second as Timothy Mercer, one of Grandma's longtime neighbors and one of the witnesses she had trusted for important documents over the years. And the third thing waiting there was a neat stack of copied papers clipped into organized sets beside a sealed envelope with my name on it in Grandma's handwriting. My knees almost gave out. The room smelled faintly of old paper and dust and brewed coffee. Rain traced the small window by the filing cabinet. For one suspended moment, I just stood there staring, unable to process the fact that my grandmother had anticipated all of this so clearly that she had arranged a defense in advance. Tristan closed the door behind us. Sit down, Serena, he said gently. There are some things you need to see before anyone asks you to sign anything. And in that moment, with my family waiting outside and my grandmother's handwriting staring back at me from the table, I understood that the funeral was not the end of her protecting me. It was the beginning of finding out just how far the others had planned to go. I sat down slowly because I honestly didn't trust my legs. The chair felt harder than it should have, and my hands were so cold from the rain that I had to press them together in my lap to stop them from shaking. Tristan took the seat across from me, while the notary opened her case and Timothy Mercer gave me a solemn nod. He looked older than I remembered, his hair more silver than brown now, but I recognized the same steady eyes. He had lived 2 houses down from Grandma for as long as I could remember. When I was little, he used to wave at me from his driveway while he washed his truck on Saturday mornings. Before we begin, Tristan said, I need you to understand that your grandmother was very clear, very organized, and very intentional. She did not leave this to chance. I looked at the sealed envelope on the table again. My name was written in Grandma's handwriting, not printed, not scribbled carelessly, written the way she always labeled jars in her pantry or cards at Christmas, with those neat letters that somehow looked both gentle and firm. I swallowed hard. She knew they'd try something? Tristan folded his hands. She believed it was a strong possibility. That sounds like yes. His face softened, but only slightly. Yes. The word hit me in a way I wasn't ready for. A part of me had still been clinging to something softer. A misunderstanding. Overeagerness. Family members being tacky and insensitive in the middle of grief, but not fully dishonest. But hearing it said plainly by someone outside the family stripped all that away. Grandma had expected them to move against me fast enough that she had arranged this room, these people, and these documents before she even died. And somehow, even in death, she had still made room to protect me. The notary, whose name was Tessa Boyd, slid a file closer to Tristan. Timothy sat quietly, his weathered hands folded over one knee. The room was so still that I could hear the old radiator clicking under the window. Tristan opened the top file. Your relatives are almost certainly about to present you with a waiver of inheritance rights, he said. It may be described as a procedural document, a temporary release, a courtesy acknowledgement, or something similarly harmless sounding. It is not harmless. I stared at him. What exactly would it do? It would remove your claim to significant portions of your grandmother's estate. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. He pulled one paper from the folder and placed it in front of me. This is a copy of the document your aunt requested a local legal assistant prepare 3 days ago. It is not enforceable until signed and properly witnessed, but the intent is plain. I looked down. Even before I understood the legal wording, I understood the structure. My name. References to waiver, relinquishment, beneficial interest, real property, cottage parcel, estate distribution. My eyes jumped over terms I didn't use in daily life, but recognized enough to make my stomach turn. Grandma's house. The cottage. My rights.
Gone.
All neatly dressed up in tidy language. I felt sick. They were going to hand me this today? I whispered. Yes, Tristan said. After the burial? Yes. I laughed once, but there was nothing funny in it. It was the kind of sound that escapes when your mind cannot absorb cruelty and disgust at the same time. Timothy finally spoke. Your grandmother told me this might happen, he said quietly. She asked me, in front of Tristan and another witness months ago, that if anything fell off after her passing, I was to make myself available. She did not trust everyone in the family equally. The careful way he said it almost made me cry again. I pressed my fingers against my lips. Why didn't she tell me everything directly? Tristan looked at the sealed envelope. She did tell you some things, I suspect. I thought of the kitchen, the hospital room. Not everyone there loves you. You turn a sharp thing in your hand and tell yourself it might not cut. My chest tightened. She warned me, I said softly. I just didn't know how far this went. She may have hoped she was wrong, he replied. But she prepared as though she were right. He reached for the envelope, then paused. Would you like to read this now? I nodded. My hands trembled when I broke the seal. Inside was a folded letter on cream stationery, written on both sides. The first line blurred instantly because tears filled my eyes before I even reached the end of the sentence. My dear Serena, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and I suspect someone has already started calling greed by a softer name. I let out a shaky breath and had to stop for a second. My throat burned. Tristan and the others waited without interrupting me. Rain tapped against the window. Somewhere in the hallway, a door opened and closed. I kept reading. You always wanted to believe the best in people. That is not a weakness, but it does become dangerous when you are surrounded by those who mistake decency for surrender. I have watched more than you realize. I know who came when they wanted something, and who came when nothing was being offered. I know who sat with me, who listened, and who looked past me toward the house, the land, and the future value of things they never cared for while I was alive. My eyes moved faster. You were never my easiest grandchild, because you saw too much. But you were my truest one. You loved me, without performance. You never came to measure curtains before I was gone. A broken little sound left me before I could stop it. That line alone told me everything. Grandma had seen them already picturing furniture, rooms, listings, sale prices. She had seen it and kept quiet until she could arrange her answer. The letter continued. The house and the cottage are not prizes for the loudest relatives. They are part of what your grandfather and I built over a lifetime of work, sacrifice, and patience. I have left my instructions clearly and legally. If anyone tells you to sign away rights for peace, remember that peace bought with your silence is rarely peace for you. Do not let guilt push your hand where truth should stop it. Trust Tristan Hale. Trust the original documents. Trust the witnesses. And above all, trust your own discomfort when kindness around you begins to feel rehearsed. You do not owe anyone gratitude for trying to take what is yours. I had to stop reading because I couldn't see anymore. I bent forward and cried into the letter, not loudly, but hard enough that my shoulders shook. It wasn't only grief then. It was grief mixed with validation, heartbreak mixed with shame for every time I had doubted my instincts, and love mixed with a sick realization that my grandmother had been preparing for me to be targeted at the exact time I would be least able to protect myself. After a minute, Tessa quietly pushed a tissue box closer. I wiped my face and kept going. There was more. Grandma explained in plain language that she had structured her estate deliberately. The house in town and the family cottage near the lake were not to be sold impulsively by whichever relatives shouted the fastest after her death. Specific shares had been assigned. Conditions had been written. Tristan had copies. Witnesses had signed. Safeguards had been added after what she called persistent and inappropriate inquiries from certain family members. Even in that line, she was still a lady. Persistent and inappropriate inquiries. That was Grandma's elegant way of saying they had circled her like vultures. At the bottom, she had written one more line that nearly undid me completely. You have spent too much of your life being told that your role is to make things easier for everyone else. It is time you stop doing that when it costs you yourself. I folded the letter carefully, but my hands still shook. No one spoke for a few seconds. Then Tristan said, "Would you like me to explain the distribution clearly?" I nodded again. He reached for another set of documents and laid them out in order. Your grandmother's primary residence in town will pass according to the estate structure she executed last year. There are liquid assets as well, but I want to start with the real property because that appears to be the central target. He spoke in a calm, measured voice that made everything easier to absorb. Grandma's house was not being left wholly to one person. Neither was the cottage. She had divided her estate carefully, but not evenly in the way my family probably expected. She had made room for several beneficiaries, yet built an oversight so that a sale could not simply be forced because louder relatives wanted quick money. I listened, blinking away tears, while he explained percentages, trusteeship conditions, protective clauses, and decision thresholds. Some of it was technical, but the important part became clear fast enough. I held a meaningful share in both the house and the cottage. Not symbolic. Not decorative.
Real.
Enough that if I signed the waiver Taylor planned to give me, I would be handing over something valuable and irreversible. I leaned back and stared at the papers. They really thought I would do it. Tristan didn't rush to answer. They appeared to have hoped that grief, social pressure, and timing would work in their favor. That's a very polite way to say they thought I'd be easy. His expression shifted, and for the first time I saw something like anger in him.
Yes, he said.
It is. Tell me this in the comments, because I know I'm not the only one who has lived it. Have you ever realized that the people around you didn't think you were kind? They thought you were convenient? Because that realization can crack something open in you. And once it does, you can never go back to pretending you didn't see the truth. Timothy cleared his throat. Your grandmother also kept notes. I looked up. Notes. He nodded toward Tristan, who pulled another slim folder from the stack. Inside were dated pages in Grandma's handwriting. Not full diary entries. More like practical observations. Short records. Conversations. Questions relatives had asked. Dates of visits. A mention that Taylor had asked whether an old power of attorney still stood. Another note that Wyatt had spoken about, getting clarity early, on the house before snow season. One line said Valerie wanted to know whether the cottage title had ever been updated after Grandpa's death. Each note by itself might have seemed small. Together, they formed a pattern so clear it made my skin crawl. She was documenting them, I said. Yes, Tristan replied. Because she wanted a record if needed. Tessa spoke gently. People do that when they sense pressure building. Especially older clients who feel vulnerable. A hot wave of guilt rose through me. I had been there. Not always, but often. Enough to hear the strain in Grandma's voice sometimes. Enough to notice those strange remarks about paperwork. Enough to know she was uneasy. And still I had not understood how isolated she must have felt while relatives politely probed around her like salespeople in a showroom. I should have done more, I whispered. No, Timothy said firmly. I looked at him. He shook his head. Don't do that to yourself. She was protecting you too, not only herself. She knew what they were like, and she knew you would try to keep the peace until there was no peace left to keep. That sounded so painfully true that I almost laughed again. Instead, I wiped my face and asked the question that had started to form. What happens now? Tristan sat straighter. Now, first, you sign nothing. Second, if a document is presented, you state that you will review all estate-related matters only through counsel. Third, I will intervene the moment any coercive language or misrepresentation occurs. Will they know you knew in advance? They may suspect. I looked at the papers, the notes, the original documents, Grandma's letter. No, I said quietly. I don't want suspicion. I want them to know. For the first time since entering that room, Tristan looked at me with something like approval. That can be arranged, he said. What followed was the strangest hour of my life. Imagine moving from raw funeral grief into a legal strategy meeting while your mascara is ruined, your shoes are damp, and your own family is waiting outside to spring a trap on you. That was me. Not glamorous. Not dramatic in the movie sense. Just emotionally exhausted and suddenly forced to grow a spine in real time. Tristan explained what I should say and what I should not say. Tessa reviewed how a valid signing process worked and why their rush itself was suspicious. Timothy confirmed he was willing to state, if needed, that Grandma had raised concerns about pressure related to the estate before her death. We didn't overcomplicate it. We didn't need to. The truth was already ugly enough. I was not going to sign anything. If they pushed, Tristan would step in. If they lied about what the document meant, he would correct them in front of everyone necessary. If they tried to turn it into a family emotion scene, he would keep it in legal language where their manipulation had less room to breathe. That mattered more than I can explain. Because families like mine thrive in blurred lines. In tears, guilt, obligation, vague expectations, and old roles. My role had always been the daughter, who kept things smooth, the dependable one, the one who absorbed discomfort, so others did not have to. But legal facts do not care who has been trained to fold themselves smaller at family gatherings. A knock came at the door then. My whole body stiffened. Tristan stood and opened it only a few inches. It was Valerie. Even through the narrow gap, I could see the polished concern on her face. There you are, she said, looking past him toward me. Mom's asking where Serena went. Everyone's waiting. We'll be out shortly, Tristan said. Valerie's smile wavered. We really just need one signature before people leave. One signature. That was all I had ever been to them in that moment. A hand. A formality. A quiet surrender with my own name at the bottom. Tristan's tone cooled by half a degree. Any estate-related documentation will be handled appropriately. Valerie's eyes flicked to me. Serena, can you come here for 1 second? No, I said. It wasn't loud, but it was the first clean no I had given my family in years. She blinked. Why are you being difficult? I stood up slowly, Grandma's letter still in my hand. Why are you in a hurry? Her mouth opened, then closed. That tiny silence gave me more strength than any speech could have. Tristan ended it there. We'll join you shortly. He closed the door. I let out a long breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Tessa gave me a small smile. That was well done. It didn't feel well done. It felt like I had just stepped onto thin ice and heard the first crack.
But I stayed standing.
And that, for me, was a beginning. When we finally walked back down the hallway, the funeral home felt different. Not safer. Just clearer. The same people were there. The same coffee urns. The same folded sympathy cards. the same low hum of voices. But I was seeing the room properly now. Taylor stood near the refreshment table with my mother. Wyatt was speaking to Vincent by the windows. Valerie had retreated to the guest book table, pretending to sort pens. The second I appeared, all of them noticed. It was subtle, but once you know people are watching you, you cannot unsee it. Taylor crossed the room first, her heels soft on the carpet. "There you are," she said, smiling with all her teeth. "We just need to tidy up one thing before everyone disperses." My mother looked tired and anxious. "Serena, if there's paperwork, maybe it's easier to do it now. We all have a long drive." There it was. Not only pressure, but maternal pressure. The old tone. The one that made logistics sound like morality. I turned toward her. "Did you read it?" She hesitated. That was enough answer. "No," I said. Taylor gave a light laugh. "It's not some terrible secret document. Then explain it." Her expression tightened, just slightly. "It's a waiver that lets the local family handle immediate estate burdens without dragging you into maintenance issues." I looked at her steadily. "So, it gives up my rights." Her face changed. Very small. Very quick.
"But I saw it." "No," she said.
"That's a dramatic way to put it. Is it inaccurate?" Wyatt stepped closer then, his voice lower. "Serena, nobody is trying to rob you." The fact that he used that exact word without me saying it told me he had already framed the accusation in his own mind. I almost admired the mistake. "Then I won't mind reviewing everything through counsel," I replied. Taylor's tone sharpened. "Counsel? Since when do we need lawyers to talk as family?" I could feel eyes turning toward us from around the room.
"Good."
For once, I wanted witnesses. I kept my voice calm. Since family started asking for legal signatures at a funeral home before Grandma was buried. That landed. A cousin near the coffee station looked up. Someone farther back stopped speaking. My mother flushed. Valerie stepped in quickly. "Please don't make this ugly," she murmured. "Everyone's emotional." That was gaslighting in its Sunday clothes. Not make it ugly. As if ugliness began when I named what they were doing, not when they planned it. Before I could answer, Tristan moved beside me. "I think," he said evenly, "this is the appropriate moment to make several things clear." Taylor's face hardened. "Excuse me?" "You may excuse yourself if you wish," Tristan replied, "but not the facts." The room had gone almost completely quiet now. I will never forget that silence. It was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of people realizing a private family script had just failed in public. Tristan continued, each word clean and measured. "Any suggestion that Serena should sign an inheritance waiver today, without independent review, under emotional pressure, and in the immediate aftermath of burial proceedings, is profoundly inappropriate." Valerie's eyes widened. No one pressured her. "Then you will have no objection," Tristan said, to her declining. Wyatt folded his arms. "This is being blown out of proportion." "Not by me," Tristan answered. Taylor tried a different tactic. "I'm her aunt. I'm trying to simplify matters. The house can't sit untouched forever." From across the room, Vincent added, "And the cottage has upkeep costs. Someone has to be practical." Practical. That word again. In my family, practicality was always what greed called itself when it wanted applause. Tristan turned slightly so the others in the room could hear him too. "The estate is already structured. There are original documents, witnesses, and clear provisions. No beneficiary is required to sign away lawful interests for the convenience of other relatives." A cousin actually gasped. My mother stared at Taylor. Valerie's face lost color. And for the first time all day, I watched the power shift. It didn't swing dramatically in 1 second.
Real life is not like that.
But you can feel a room turning when the polished people realize the quiet one is no longer standing alone. Taylor's voice came out thinner. "What lawful interests?" Tristan looked at her. "The ones you were hoping Serena had not yet confirmed." That was the moment the mask broke. Not all at once, but enough. Taylor's chin lifted. "Are you accusing me of something?" "I am stating that your proposed document materially disadvantages Serena," Tristan said. "And that Ms. Boyd, a notary, can confirm proper execution standards were not being respected. Tessa stepped forward just enough to be seen. I can confirm that any rushed presentation of such a document, framed as mere formality, would be deeply concerning. Timothy appeared beside her like quiet proof from another generation. And I can confirm, he said, voice rough but steady, that Trinity expressed concern before her death about being questioned on estate matters in ways she did not trust. That did it. You could almost hear the room inhale. My mother turned to Taylor fully. You talked to her about the estate? Taylor snapped. Of course I did. Somebody had to. That was the wrong answer. Everyone heard it. Not because talking about an estate is automatically wrong, but because of the way she said it. Irritated. Entitled. Like Grandma's life had turned into an overdue administrative burden. Wyatt tried to recover it. No one did anything improper. Then why was Serena being approached privately with a waiver? Tristan asked. No one answered. Valerie looked at me with that wounded expression manipulative people wear when they realize shame might work better than authority. Serena, she said softly, you know we'd never hurt you. I looked at her and thought about every family dinner where I had been diminished while she stayed comfortable. Every time she had watched me carry more than my share and called it my personality. Every time she had wrapped insult in concern and expected gratitude for the packaging. Then I thought about Grandma's letter in my hand. You do not owe anyone gratitude for trying to take what is yours. No, I said. I know exactly what you thought I would do. Another silence followed. This one belonged to me. I want to pause here and ask you something because moments like this change a person forever. Have you ever reached the point where one honest sentence from you made everybody else panic because it broke the role they assigned you years ago? I had been the accommodating daughter for so long that the simple act of refusing felt almost violent to them. But sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is stop cooperating with your own erasure. The confrontation didn't end there. That would have been too easy. Humiliated people rarely back down gracefully, especially when money is involved. Taylor pulled my mother aside, but not far enough that I couldn't hear the hiss in her voice. She's misunderstanding everything. My mother looked overwhelmed. Then, why didn't you show me the full document first? Wyatt stepped between them. This is not the time. No, I said, surprising even myself. This is exactly the time. All eyes came back to me again. I held up Grandma's letter. She knew, I said. She knew some of you would try to pressure me. She prepared for it. She left instructions. She left witnesses. So if anyone wants to keep acting like I'm being dramatic, do it without pretending she would have approved. Valerie stared. She wrote you a letter? I almost laughed at the audacity of her sounding hurt. As if the betrayal here was not the trap, but the fact that Grandma had trusted me with private words. Yes, I said. Taylor's face went stiff. Well, I'd like to see it.
No.
She looked genuinely shocked. Again, that tiny, beautiful shock. Because people who are used to crossing boundaries always act wounded when one is finally locked. You can't just, she began. I can, I said. And I am. Tristan stepped in before the argument spiraled into something uglier. All future estate communication will go through my office. No one here should present Serena with additional documents. If any are presented, my advice remains unchanged. Do not sign. He let that settle. Then, in front of the whole room, he added, there are original records on file, along with witness support, regarding the decedent's concerns about coercive handling of estate matters. That sentence did what anger could not. It made consequences feel real. Not emotional consequences. Not family tension. Legal consequences. Documentation. Records. Witnesses. The kind of words that make careless people suddenly remember they are not as clever as they thought. Vincent muttered something under his breath and walked away toward the hallway. Wyatt stopped speaking entirely. Taylor turned pale around the mouth. Valerie looked from one face to another like she couldn't figure out which emotional performance would save her fastest. Only my mother looked truly shaken, and that hurt more than I expected. Because beneath everything else, part of me had still wanted her not to know. Or, at least not to know enough to let herself be used by the others. But the hesitation in her eyes told me she had known this was not nothing. She may not have understood every legal detail, but she had understood enough to stay conveniently uninformed while pushing me toward a signature anyway. That realization settled somewhere deep and hard inside me. Not explosive.
Permanent.
Eventually, the room broke apart in awkward fragments. Some relatives left quickly, murmuring condolences that now sounded embarrassed. A few avoided my eyes entirely. Others gave me that cautious, curious look people get when they realize a family story they accepted too easily has another side. One older cousin squeezed my arm on her way out and whispered, "Your grandmother was very proud of you." I almost started crying again, right there. But I didn't. Instead, I held on to those words like something warm. By early evening, the funeral home had mostly emptied. Rain still tapped the windows. The light outside had gone full gray blue, and the parking lot reflected everything in long, wet streaks. My mother had left with Valerie without saying goodbye properly. Taylor and Wyatt disappeared after a clipped conversation with Tristan that I could not hear but did not need to. Timothy went home after promising to remain available if needed. Tessa packed her briefcase and gave me one last steady nod. Then, it was just me and Tristan in the family room with the coffee gone lukewarm. I sank into one of the chairs and suddenly felt every hour of the day at once. "I'm sorry," I said without thinking. He looked up from gathering papers. "For what?" "For being a mess." A faint smile touched his mouth. "I would be more concerned if you weren't." That surprised a tired laugh out of me. He sat across from me again, less formally now. Without the audience and the confrontation, he seemed younger. Not young exactly, but not as distant as he had earlier. His tie was slightly loosened. Rain had dried in faint marks on one shoulder of his coat. "I need to tell you what comes next," he said. I nodded. He explained the process carefully. The estate would proceed through proper channels. No sudden sales. No backroom shortcuts. No one could simply decide Grandma's house or cottage would be listed because they felt like moving on. There would be notices, timelines, documentation, review. I would receive copies. He would represent the estate according to Grandma's instructions, and I could retain separate counsel too if I wished. Listening to him was the first time all day I felt the shape of safety again. Not comfort. Not happiness. Just structure. And after a day like that, structure felt holy. When he finished, I stared at the rain-streaked parking lot and said, "I don't know why she trusted me so much." He was quiet for a second. "From what I observed," he said, "she trusted you because you showed up when there was nothing to gain." I looked down. He added, "That's rarer than you think." The drive back to Toronto that night was brutal. Not because of snow. It was too early for that. Just rain, darkness, and exhaustion. Highway lights smeared gold across wet lanes. My windshield wipers sounded too loud. My eyes burned. I pulled into an owner at once for coffee I barely tasted and sat in the car for 5 extra minutes because I didn't trust myself to merge back onto the highway while crying. When I finally got home, my apartment felt both too small and too quiet. I left my black shoes by the door, set Grandma's letter on the kitchen table like it was fragile glass, and stood in the middle of the room not knowing what to do with myself. The fridge hummed. A streetcar rattled somewhere outside. My coat still smelled faintly of rain and funeral home lilies. Then my phone lit up.
"Valerie."
I let it ring out. A text came seconds later. "You embarrassed everyone today." I stared at it. Then another. "Aunt Taylor was only trying to simplify things. You always make situations bigger than they need to be." And then the one that finally made me laugh out loud in my empty kitchen. "Grandma would hate how you acted." That was the moment I blocked her. Not because I was strong and composed and finally healed. I blocked her because I was too tired to let poison in any further. Then I blocked Taylor too. And when my mother texted, "Can we talk tomorrow?" I didn't block her. But I didn't answer that night. For the first time in years, I chose silence without guilt. The next few weeks were ugly in the way family ugliness usually is. Not dramatic every second. Just relentless. Messages came through other relatives. A cousin said Taylor was heartbroken by how the funeral turned out. Wyatt told someone I had been manipulated by legal opportunists. Valerie apparently cried to anyone willing to listen that I had turned Grandma's death into a money issue, which would have been almost funny if it weren't so shameless. My mother kept trying to arrange a private lunch in Mississauga, just to talk like mother and daughter, as if the problem were tone, not betrayal. Meanwhile, Tristan's office began sending me official documents. Clean copies. Clear summaries. Timelines. I read everything carefully. Sometimes twice. That became my new life for a while. Work in Toronto by day, estate documents at night, and grief somewhere underneath, everything like a low ache that never left. I still missed Grandma in the ordinary moments most. When I saw butter tarts in a bakery case. When I reached for my phone after a long day and remembered there was no one to call at her number anymore. When Sunday came and I thought about the porch on her house, the way late afternoon light used to hit the side yard. But grief was no longer the only thing filling the space she left. There was anger too, and clarity. Both, it turns out, can be useful. About a month after the funeral, Tristan called and asked if I could meet him at his office in the town on a Saturday. There had been new developments. I drove out again, this time under a cold, clear sky. Bare branches cut against the light. The town looked quieter without funeral traffic, more itself. His office was above a small insurance business on the main street, with a brass plaque by the entrance and old wood stairs that creaked faintly. He was already waiting with files laid out. "There's good news," he said after I sat down. I blinked. "In this family?" He almost smiled. "In the law, yes." Apparently, Taylor and Wyatt had pushed harder than I realized in the days after the funeral. There had been attempts to inquire about interim handling of the house. Casual suggestions about maintenance access. Questions that weren't illegal in themselves, but revealed how fast they had expected control. Worse for them, one email from Wyatt to a local contact referred to getting Serena's release finalized quickly before she changes her mind, which was a catastrophically foolish thing to put in writing before I had signed anything at all. When Tristan showed me that line, I stared at it and then leaned back in my chair. He really wrote that? He did. So, they weren't even trying to be subtle. They were trying, Tristan said dryly. They were simply not as careful as they imagined. That email mattered because it confirmed intent, not just a misunderstanding, not just practical confusion. Intent. He also informed me that the original estate documents were even more protective than I had first understood. Grandma had included provisions that made forced quick sale behavior much harder, particularly where beneficiaries had conflicting interests. She had known exactly the kind of family she was leaving behind, and she had put legal brakes wherever she could. That was when I finally understood something fully. Grandma had not just loved me. She had respected me enough to arm me. That changed the way I carried myself after that. At work, I was still the same Serena on paper. Same apartment. Same transit delays. Same client calls. Same grocery budget. Same inbox. But internally, something had shifted. I stopped apologizing so quickly. I stopped answering family messages the same day they arrived. I stopped assuming every request deserved my time just because it came from blood. And slowly, almost awkwardly, I began to rebuild a life that was not organized around other people's convenience. I started seeing a therapist in Toronto, a woman named Skylar who had the calmest office I had ever been in and a talent for asking one question that could undo a whole week of self-deception. On my third session, after I finished explaining the funeral mess, she said, "What would happen if you stopped trying to be understood by people who benefit from misunderstanding you?" I just stared at her, because that was it. That was my whole family pattern in one sentence. Around the same time, I reconnected with an old friend named Zachary. We had known each other years earlier through work contacts, then drifted after one of us switched jobs. He was living in Etobicoke now and working in facilities management for a hotel chain. Solid, funny, observant. Not flashy. The kind of man who listened fully before speaking, which after a family like mine felt almost suspicious in the beginning. Nothing dramatic happened there at first. He just became someone I could have coffee with and not perform around. Someone who didn't treat my family situation like gossip or a puzzle to solve. Someone who, when I told him what had happened, said, "That's brutal. and left enough silence after it for me to breathe.
Sometimes kindness is not grand.
Sometimes it is simply the absence of manipulation. By late fall, the estate pressure had built toward what would become the final real confrontation. Tristan arranged a formal family meeting at his office because too many assertions were being made by too many people who suddenly had selective memory. Not a court hearing, not something cinematic, but formal enough that everyone would have to sit in a room, hear the same facts, and stop pretending the waiver issue had been blown out of proportion. I knew Taylor would come. So would Wyatt and Valerie. My mother too. Vincent, if only to loom in a corner and look offended. I also knew something else by then. I was no longer scared of the room. Nervous, yes.
Still hurt, yes.
But not scared in the old way. Because fear thrives when everything is vague, and by then almost nothing was vague anymore. On the morning of the meeting, I dressed simply. Navy coat, cream sweater, dark trousers, low boots. No dramatic revenge outfit. No movie makeover.
Just clothes that made me feel like myself.
I tied my hair back, put on minimal makeup, and tucked Grandma's letter into my bag. Not because I intended to show it, because I wanted her with me. Before I went in, Zachary texted, "You don't owe anyone your collapse just because they're upset they got caught." I looked at that message for a second and smiled. Then I put my phone away and went upstairs. Here's the question I want to ask you before the climax, because this part matters more than people think. When you finally get the chance to confront the people who underestimated you, do you want revenge or do you want the truth to stand there without flinching? At that point, I realized I didn't need a dramatic speech nearly as much as I needed the facts to stay upright in the room. And once the facts did that, the lies started collapsing on their own. The boardroom in Tristan's office wasn't large, but it was formal enough to make everyone sit straighter than usual. Long table, water glasses, blinds half open to a dull Ontario afternoon, a tray of untouched coffee near the side cabinet. Tessa was there too, not because she had to dramatize anything, but because her presence mattered. Timothy arrived a few minutes later, steady as ever. Taylor looked offended before anyone spoke. Wyatt looked irritated. Valerie looked like she had chosen her outfit carefully for sympathy, soft colors, understated jewelry, an expression of controlled sadness. My mother just looked tired. Vincent had the restless energy of a man who thought this was all beneath him but had still shown up because he wanted to witness the outcome. Tristan began without small talk. He reviewed the estate structure, the original documents, the witnessing, the legal significance of beneficiary rights, the impropriety of rushed waiver presentation under funeral circumstances. Then, he placed a copy of the draft waiver on the table. Not the original. A copy. But it might as well have been a mirror shoved in front of them. Taylor's face tightened instantly. That was never finalized. No, Tristan said. Because Serena did not sign it. Wyatt leaned back. So, what exactly is the point of this? The point, Tristan replied, is to end the fiction that Serena's concerns were invented. Valerie folded her hands. No one denied she was upset. I spoke for the first time. You told people I turned Grandma's death into money. She looked at me, eyes wide and soft. Because that's how it felt. That line would have worked on the old me. The new me just looked back and said, "Interesting. To me it felt like you all tried to turn my grief into a deadline." She actually flinched. Tessa then explained, in plain and professional language, why presenting a document like that under those conditions was deeply problematic. No moral speech. No theatrics. Just a calm description of execution standards, informed consent, and pressure concerns. Then Timothy spoke. He described, without embellishment, how Grandma had voiced discomfort months earlier. How she had mentioned questions about her assets. How she wanted records kept. How she had specifically feared that Serena, me, would be treated as the easiest person to push aside. When he said that last part, no one looked at me. Because they couldn't. Then Tristan produced the email from Wyatt. The room went still. Wyatt read it once, jaw hardening, then said, "That's being taken out of context." "No," Tristan said. "It is being read." It was one of the most satisfying lines I have ever heard in my life. Taylor tried to recover the moral ground. We were trying to preserve the property. By removing my share? I asked. For practical management, she said sharply. I tilted my head. Were you planning to preserve the money too? That was when Vincent muttered, "This is ridiculous." And that opened the door for everything that followed. Because once the polished adults lose control, the sloppier ones often finish the job for them. Vincent started talking too much. About upkeep. About market conditions. About how the cottage had dead-weight beneficiaries if some people lived in Toronto and only visited occasionally. The second he said dead weight, the room changed. My mother looked horrified. Valerie hissed, "Vincent, stop." But it was too late. He had said out loud what all of them had been organizing politely for months. Dead weight. That was what I was in their minds. Not a granddaughter. Not a rightful beneficiary. Not the person who had shown up for Grandma. Just an obstacle between them and smoother access. I looked at him and, to my own surprise, felt almost nothing. No fresh hurt. Just confirmation. And confirmation can be incredibly peaceful after years of confusion. Tristan closed the folder in front of him. "I believe," he said, "we are finished with any claim that Serena misunderstood the situation." Wyatt's voice came out low and angry. "So what now?" "Now," Tristan said, "the estate proceeds according to the decedent's lawful instructions." Taylor stared at me. "You'd really do this to family?" I met her eyes. And finally, I understood the question for what it was. Not moral. Strategic. People say that line when they mean, "Will you continue refusing to make this easy for us?" "Yes," I said. It was the cleanest answer I have ever given. No explanation. No apology. Just yes. What happened next was not a courtroom explosion or someone collapsing to the floor. Real life is usually quieter than that. But I watched consequences land in ways that mattered. Taylor's influence over the family story weakened overnight because too many people now knew the truth. Wyatt stopped messaging through intermediaries once he understood documentation existed that made him look reckless. Valerie tried for a while to position herself as the peacemaker, then stopped when I refused private calls. My mother eventually admitted, in a broken little conversation months later, that she had suspected the waiver was more than a formality, but told herself Taylor knew better. That confession did not repair much, but at least it was honest. The biggest consequence was this. They lost control of the narrative. And families like mine depend on control of the narrative almost more than they depend on money. The estate moved forward properly. The house was maintained, not rushed onto the market in a feeding frenzy. The cottage remained protected under the structure Grandma intended. No quick cash out. No convenient erasure. No smiling manipulation wrapped in funeral black. My share stayed mine. More than that, my voice stayed mine. Winter came early that year. By December, the town roads near Grandma's place had that familiar Ontario look, snow piled in rough white banks, salt crusting the shoulders, trees standing bare against a pale sky. I drove out once with Tristan's permission to collect a few personal items Grandma had explicitly left for me. Recipe tins, 2 photo albums, 1 quilt, a box of letters, and a small ceramic jar from the kitchen that had always held sugar packets she stole from cafes. The house was cold, but intact. I stood in the kitchen for a long time with my gloves tucked into my pockets, looking at the table where we had sat together so many times. I imagined her there, glasses low on her nose, making a grocery list or pretending not to notice that I was sad about something until I finally said it. Then I looked out toward the yard and thought about what she had done. She had not only loved me in warm ways. She had loved me in protective ways. I don't think we talk enough about that kind of love. The kind that prepares a shield. The kind that watches quietly, recognizes danger early, and leaves behind enough truth to keep you from being devoured after they're gone. I packed the quilt carefully. I took the recipe tins. I cried once, softly, by the back door. Then I locked the house behind me and drove back to Toronto. My life now is not a fairy tale, and I'm glad it isn't. I still work hard. I still miss Grandma. I still have complicated feelings about my mother. Valerie and I barely speak. Taylor and Wyatt exist at a distance that feels healthy. Vincent can stay offended for the rest of his life, for all I care. But I sleep better. I eat dinner without checking my phone for family pressure. I go to therapy. I meet Zachary sometimes for coffee, sometimes for dinner, and sometimes for long walks where neither of us has to fill every silence. Whatever that becomes, I'm letting it become slowly, like something real. And something else changed too. At my parents' restaurant in Mississauga, I am no longer the invisible daughter who can be summoned for labor and then dismissed when the smiling photos are taken. The first time my father called asking if I could just come in for the weekend and help like old times, I said no. Not angrily, just no. When he pushed, I said I was unavailable. When my mother hinted that family should be there for family, I almost laughed at the timing. Boundaries have a way of sounding rude only to people who benefited from your lack of them. A few months ago, I made Grandma's butter tarts in my Toronto apartment from the recipe card she left me. The crust was imperfect, and I overfilled 2 of them, but the smell alone made the place feel warmer. I stood there in my kitchen, snow falling outside the window, and realized I wasn't thinking about what my family took from me anymore. I was thinking about what stayed.
Her handwriting.
Her warning.
Her trust.
Her refusal to let me be quietly erased. That is the inheritance I feel every day. Not only the legal one, the emotional one too. The knowledge that I was never weak just because I was kind. The understanding that being the daughter who keeps the peace is only noble until everyone starts using it as a tool against you. And the certainty that some doors look dark only because they lead you out of a lie. From everything I went through, I learned that people who rush you, guilt you, or shame you into signing away your rights are not protecting peace. They're protecting their own advantage. I also learned that kindness without boundaries invites the wrong people to mistake your decency for surrender. If you're in a situation like mine once was, please remember this. Slowing down, asking questions, and saying no can save more than your money. It can save your dignity too. If this story made you think of someone in your own life, right, I would have walked away too in the comments and tell me what part hit you the hardest. And if you've ever gone through something similar, or you want to share your own story, write it below so other people know they're not alone. Please share this story with your friends across Canada and beyond. Like the video, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story.